I'm sick of the lie that everyone keeps repeating. There's a phrase I've been hearing for months, a phrase that you probably heard hundreds of times too. Barça has no money. Barça can't sign players. Barça can't compete for top-level players. Barça can't pay Julián Álvarez. And I'm going to be very honest with you. A few months ago, I could even understand this narrative because the club's financial situation was very complicated. Because financial fair play suffocated every move. Because every signing seemed like an impossible deal. Every registration became a battle. But something really catches my attention. If Barça really doesn't have money, if Barça really can't compete, if Julián Álvarez is really impossible, why is Deco acting as if it's possible? Why has Laporta gotten personally involved in this operation? Why has Barça already made an offer of 100 million euros? Why has Fabrizio Romano, who only gets involved when there are real negotiations, spoken so strongly about this? Why is Atletico de Madrid taking all of this so seriously? Because if there's one thing I've learned from following previous transfer markets, it's that clubs don't invest time in impossible deals. Not at the level we're seeing now. And this is where the first big question of this video comes up. Julián Álvarez is crazy about coming to Barça. Atletico de Madrid is standing firm and for now doesn't want to sell him. But the real question is, can Barça really afford a deal of that magnitude? Why? Because when you start analyzing the numbers, you discover something very interesting. And that's because Barça that finished last season is not the same Barça that's entering this transfer market. Not even remotely similar. And it all starts with a deal that almost no one talks about anymore. Do you remember the famous VIP seats? That deal sparked a debate for months. Well, that deal that seemed endless, that deal that many thought was practically lost, has actually turned out to be much more important than it seemed. Because while most of the fans were focused on the signings, inside the club, they were focused on something even more important. The auditor. Pay attention to this information, because the auditor was the one who had to validate a fundamental part of Barça's economic plan. And when that validation came, it completely changed the scenario we have today. Because we're talking about more than 71 million euros. Get your calculator. I'll give you the figures. 71 million euros, that's not a small amount. It's not just any sponsorship. It's not a one-time sale. We're talking about an amount that directly affects the club's operational capacity. And here's where something even more important comes in. Because that's not the only source of income that comes into play for Barça. There's another one that could be even more relevant in the medium term. We're talking about the Spotify Camp Nou. Because for years we've talked about the new stadium as a project for the future. But gentlemen, the future is already here. The gradual opening of the stadium means more spectators. Therefore, for Barça, it has generated more income. There will be more boxes, more ticketing, more money, and the internal forecasts point to something spectacular. Approximately 50 million euros extra, 50 million family. And this is where the story really starts to change. Because we're no longer just talking about reducing losses, which was Laporta's #1 task when he became president of Barça. We're talking about generating resources. We're talking about growing again. We're talking about regaining financial strength. And when you combine the income from the VIP seats with the new revenue from the Camp Nou, you start to understand why there's an optimism within the club that didn't exist a year ago. But pay attention, because we still haven't reached the move that really changes everything. The move that will allow Deco to look directly at Julián Álvarez. Robert Lewandowski, yes, probably the best striker Barcelona has had in recent years. A footballer who has given a lot, who has been exemplary, a goal scorer, but also one of those with the most important contracts in the squad. Pay attention to this, everyone. This is where the real numbers come in. Because Lewandowski is leaving Barça, And not only is he leaving a position that we have to fill, he frees up a huge amount of resources that Barça will take advantage of to be able to register players. We're talking about 38.5 million euros. I'll say it again, 38.5 million euros. Just with the departure of the Polish striker, which is an absolutely huge figure. This is where the story that Barça has no room in its wage bill, that Barça has no room under fair play, that Barça has no money to make signings starts to fall apart. Because when you add up everything we've mentioned before, the VIP seats, the ticketing income from Camp Nou, the departure, the salary space freed up by Robert Lewandowski, the situation starts to look very different, much more favorable for Barça, much more stable, much closer to normal. And that's exactly what explains why Laporta has been conveying calm for weeks, because the club knows that many people still haven't fully understood this. The finances are improving a lot, but just when it seemed like there was a huge margin, a small problem appears. Anthony Gordon. And this is where we move on to the next chapter, because while everyone was talking about Julián Álvarez, Deco had already made the first big move of the summer, signing Anthony Gordon. A transfer that hasn't exactly been cheap. We'll see. The future will tell if it was or not. 70 million euros fixed, plus 10 million in add-ons. A significant investment for Barça. But there are a lot of people here who get confused, and that's why I'm going to explain it to you. Because it's not enough to just look at the transfer fee. You have to understand how it affects fair play. And here, according to information published by our colleague Victor Malo from Kulemania, the annual cost of Anthony Gordon is around 26 million euros, including salary and amortization. Take note, 26 million euros. That means part of the margin generated is already committed. And for a few days, it seemed that the available margin was shrinking again, but then another deal appeared. A deal much less publicized, much less spectacular, but possibly just as important. Because this is where a player very dear to Barça comes into the picture. Ansu Fati. Ansu Fati, who has left the club. And here Deco once again shows that you don't win in the transfer market just by signing players, but also by selling them. Because the Ansu Fati deal generates two simultaneous benefits. First, immediate money. Second, salary savings. A perfect combination for fair play. And when you do the math, the result is huge. Practically 20 million euros of improvement. Family, 20 million. That puts Barça back in a very interesting position. And this is where we get to the most important number in the whole video. Write down this figure, 64 million euros, 64 million euros. That's the approximate margin Barça would have after all these operations. And now comes the question that changes everything. Is it enough to sign Julián Álvarez and be able to register him in La Liga? Because of course, it's one thing to have 64 million euros and a very different thing to be able to sign the player for an investment of 150 million euros. That would be, let's say, the maximum amount that Atletico de Madrid will demand from you to negotiate and to accept the offer. Well, this is where the most interesting part of our story comes in. Because elite signings don't work the way people imagine. They're not paid all at once. There isn't a single lump sum payment. It doesn't work like that. They're structured, amortized, and spread out over the years of the contract. And this completely changes the picture. Because family keeps something in mind. Even if Atletico de Madrid asked for a huge amount, like these 150 million euros, the annual impact would be very different. And that's where Deco is working. That's where the executives do the math. And that's where the famous fair play becomes the main character. Because for the first time in a long time, Barça can sit at the negotiating table without feeling inferior to their rival. And that's huge news. But there's still something more important than the numbers. Something that no account can reflect. And that's the will of the player. Because in the end, it all comes down to one question. What does he want to play? Julián Álvarez. And this is where the main characters from previous weeks, like Fabrizio Romano, Gaston Guedul, Veronica Brunati, all the information matched that Julián wants to listen to Barça. Julián wants Hansi Flick's project. Julián wants to be one of the faces of the new Barça project. And that completely changes the negotiation. Because Atletico de Madrid can ask for a lot of money. They can make the talks tougher. They can even delay the decisions. They can play all the cards they want. But there's something that no club can fully control. The will of the football player. And that's why this summer promises to be truly crazy. Because a few months ago, they told us it was impossible. That it was just fantasy. That Barça couldn't compete for anyone. And yet today the numbers are starting to add up. Today fair play is starting to smile on Barça. Today Deco has enough room to work. And today Julián Álvarez no longer seems like an impossible dream. It's still difficult, very complicated. But for the first time in a long time, it's a real possibility. And that's probably the most important news of all. Because if the numbers already add up, the next question is even more dangerous for Atletico de Madrid. What will happen when Julián Álvarez starts? Will he start pushing to wear the Blaugrana shirt? Let me know in the comments what you think of this awesome video. Smash the like button and hype up the video. Barça yesterday, Barça today, Barça always. Thank you.